Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings of peace. My name is Huzaifa Shabazz. I'm the Research and Advocacy Coordinator at CAIR National, welcoming you to today's episode of CAIR on Air. Thank you for joining us. We are happy to welcome on all of our viewers, including those from American Muslim 360 and those of you who are watching from Facebook and YouTube. Today's program is What is Juneteenth? A historical overview of Freedom Day. This event is part of CAIR's Diversity Month, and this month's theme is Juneteenth, spearheaded by CAIR Houston. And today I'm excited to welcome on two very special guests from CAIR Texas. We'd like to welcome on Ambreen Hernandez, who serves as the Director of Operations for the Houston chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. And we have Mustafa Carroll, who is the former Executive Director of CAIR Houston. Welcome. How are you all?
Alhamdulillah. We're doing fine. Well, I'm doing fine. I don't know about Amber.
Doing excellent. You know, we've got a Texas heat wave coming in, but alhamdulillah, you know, thank God for AC. So yeah.
It's here.
I'm not going to complain about San Francisco to you guys then.
Please don't.
Well,
I know how that is.
Right. Well, I really want to thank you all for coming, and I want to transition here to Ambreen, who's really going to spearhead this conversation with Mustafa, and then I'll follow up with some of the questions I have. So please, Ambreen, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And Brother Huzaifa, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and the entire CAIR team for their support and vision in launching the Diversity Campaign Series. It's really an honor to be here today, and with one of my favorite people in Texas too. I wanted to kind of talk about why it's so important to commemorate this important time and moment that happened in our American history, and before we kick off the program officially. But before I kind of go into that, for those of you who are unfamiliar with CAIR Houston, we serve one of the largest Muslim populations in Texas, and alhamdulillah, we've been serving the community for 19 years and counting. Something else that's a really fun fact, Houston is also known for being one of the nation's most diverse cities in America. And with that, it's so rich in history, and we are constantly seeing history in the making as well. And while that history is in the making, it's important that as we do this work, as we work with one another in solidarity, that we explore and reflect, right, on the history that has led us to where we are today. And one of those being Juneteenth. Alhamdulillah. So with that, I want to kind of bridge the connection that we as American Muslims have to this event. As American Muslims, it is imperative that we learn our history, especially especially on the accounts of oppression, racial injustice, and inequality towards our African American brothers and sisters. As American Muslims, of course, too, it's important that we remember that there is a connection, again, between us and those that were enslaved, right? As up to a third of the enslaved West Africans were Muslims from various different groups. So we have a moral imperative here to honor them, to honor our history by telling their stories and revisiting, again, the events that led us to be where we are today. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, "Do you know what the greatest ascent is? It is the freeing of a slave." And that illustrates to us many things. It illustrates to us what a blessing the ending of slavery was and is from an Islamic perspective. And alhamdulillah, it changed America tremendously, but we still have a very long way to go. And that's important for us to remember in building a better tomorrow. So without further ado, I want to introduce you all to someone I consider a mentor, a soundboard, and as I embark personally and professionally on this journey, he's a longtime civil rights activist who has served as CAIR Houston's executive director for over 8 years, mashallah. And there's so many wonderful things I can say to go on here, but I'm gonna let him take over. Welcoming Brother Mustafa to today's special program. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and Jazakallah khair. This is a really important topic, and I think I've always contended that in order for us as American Muslims to be really to excel in this activism work is that we have to understand the history in this country. And I think that a lot of times that is the missing link to our understanding, that we don't understand the history of what has gone before. I think most Muslims know who Malcolm is, they know who MLK was, Rosa Parks, but when it gets down to the really nitty-gritty historical issues, that's where we fall short. Now, Juneteenth, aka Freedom Day, aka Jubilee Day, aka Liberation Day, and Emancipation Day, is the oldest known celebration honoring the end of slavery in the U.S. And it's also may be said that slavery in the U.S. was not like any other slavery that we know of other than Pharaoh, that it was intended to be perpetual. That meant that your kids, and their kids, etc., would be slaves forever. So it was actually a really huge undertaking for that to happen. Now, during the Civil War, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation by executive order on September 22nd, 1862, which effectively took place. It actually became effective January 1st, 1863. And it declared that all enslaved persons in the Confederate States be freed. It originated in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, and that's where we get the name Juneteenth from, 1865, probably a few months before my maternal grandfather was born, and announced via general order by General Gordon Granger, proclaiming Freedom Day in Texas 2.5 years after the proclamation. So people in Texas, or those persons enslaved in Texas, found out 2.5 years later, and that's approximately 250,000 enslaved Texans had no idea that their freedom had been secured by the government, that they found out 2.5 years later. When I first came to Texas, and I do have roots here because my father's from Texas, but I didn't know much about Juneteenth. I found that out after living here for so long, about what it meant and where it came from, because I was first asked, are you going to celebrate Juneteenth? And my first question was, well, what's that? So it's important to understand a few things about Juneteenth. Now, being that the country was in the midst of civil war, those states that had seceded from the Union didn't adhere to that proclamation. That was number one. And the other thing, and I think it's a big misunderstanding, is that people say, well, Lincoln freed the slaves, and there is some who believe that Lincoln's intent was to free the slaves. And Lincoln's had no intent of freeing the slaves, and his purpose was to save the Union. And he was quoted publicly saying, my paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. So that's one of the misunderstandings that we have. Now, the other thing is that slavery was still legal in practice in 2 Union border states, that is Delaware and Kentucky, if you can believe that. Delaware, I didn't know that originally that Delaware was such a significant slave state, but those were still practiced in the Union border states. And then here's some other information that we gathered from this, was that Indian territories, specifically the Choctaw Nation, had sided with the Confederacy, and they didn't release those persons who were enslaved until 1866. So that makes it 3.5 years after it ended. Some other notable information is that one of the last native folks with a Muslim name, Ramadan Wati, his son, Salahuddin Wati, aka Stan Wati, who was a Cherokee, was a Confederate brigadier general, and that he actually helped to call for peace in the Civil War. Now, the celebrations actually dated back until 1866. They were more church-centered community gatherings. And in the 1870s, a group of former slaves pooled around $800 or so together through their local churches and purchased 10 acres of land and created Emancipation Park to host the Juneteenth celebrations in what is now modern-day Houston. So where you have Emancipation Park, and I'm very familiar with that area because I used to go down there all the time. This is part of that history, that it was created as a way for people to celebrate Juneteenth. Now, those celebrations spread across the South and became more commercialized in the 1920s and 30s, but it was eclipsed by the struggle for civil rights and grew in popularity in the 70s with a focus on African-American freedom and art. So, you know, if you look at the historical significance during the 70s and even prior to that, in the 60s was a very turbulent time in this country. And so the focus was civil rights, civil liberties, etc. And somehow Juneteenth wasn't, you know, had been eclipsed by those events. So that's important for us to note that. So sometimes when you think, well, what happened? That was what happened. Those were some of the things. And considering that in 1954, the civil rights movement was the official start date for the civil rights movement with Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, in 1980, we had Emancipation Day in Texas became a legal state holiday in recognition of Juneteenth. However, the state offices didn't completely close. And by the 21st century, Juneteenth is celebrated in most major cities in the U.S., with the exception of North Dakota and South Dakota. Those are the only two states that don't recognize Juneteenth. Also, I know it's Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee had actually tried to get Juneteenth recognized as a federal holiday. So that's a brief overview of Juneteenth, and I'll entertain any questions that you might have after that. Hello?
Thank you, Brother Mustafa. Thank you for that historical overview. Really appreciate that. I learned a lot from you. I want to follow up with some questions I have as well, and some questions I've written before. I just want to talk about the you mentioned the federal holiday, and you know, we know that 3 states have not recognized Juneteenth, and that includes North Dakota, South Dakota, Hawaii. So I'm posing the question here, you know, what kind of message does that send to the American public when such a holiday isn't recognized?
Well, you know, we always, the public has been struggling with this for years. I mean, recognition. I mean, yes, we have it official in many places, but recognition in a way that's productive is what I'm looking at now. I'm not looking at just, oh, well, yeah, they had this or that happened. You know, in Texas, actually, with the State Board of Education in Texas, they're trying to change history. They're trying to write it off. So it's important that we recognize it in a productive way, that it's American history, that it's not just an issue of African-American history. And that's been part of the problem. One of the reasons that people don't know about Juneteenth or don't understand the history is because we've been segregated for years. And so as a result of that, the African-American community leadership had to develop systems of its own. So the history that I may have and others my age or even younger may have is not the same type of history that you might get in school. We understand because we were obligated to learn that. So understanding Juneteenth and its significance, like what did it mean for people to be, number one, understand the truth about it. That Lincoln's point was to save the Union. It wasn't that he liked slaves or he felt a moral imperative. He was trying to politically solve the issue of the Union. The same thing came in the 60s with Kennedy. The Kennedys weren't saviors of African-American liberation, anything. They didn't really do, they did it from a political position. And one of the reasons that that everything has been labored and has taken so long is because it's been politicized.
Right.
So it's important that we recognize the reality and the truth of what has happened in this country so that we can remedy some of those issues. And Juneteenth is just one of those things.
Absolutely. Those are really great points. And I want to follow up on that and ask you, what are some of the most pressing, civil rights issues as it pertains to African Americans and as it relates to Juneteenth? How can we recognize that and then use it as a way to improve some of the most current social political issues? And what are the most pressing issues of those that you would recognize? Again, if you can talk more about that.
Well, Juneteenth is just another one of those holidays or those occurrences in history that call us to recognize and to challenge some of the issues that we have today because they've stayed with us for so long. And just for the fact that we can take from history that people didn't know that they were free. We've had several instances of that. I remember Harriet Tubman is quoted as saying that she freed so many slaves, but she could have freed 1,000 more if they only realized that they were slaves. And I think recognition or understanding or being aware of what's going on in the country is number one. Number two is I hope we can use it more. I'm not so much for celebration as I am for strategizing. I think the day for celebrating, we always have plenty of room to celebrate. But what are we celebrating? We're celebrating the fact that people found out 2.5 years later that they were free. We have those issues going on now in a different way. They've taken a different form that people don't realize, that Muslims don't realize the kind of issues that face Muslims now. And so it's important, it's imperative that we start to begin to understand how we fit in this mosaic that we call United States of America. That it's not simple enough to just celebrate, but it's important and it's imperative for us to develop a strategy. I had a conversation this morning about the Palestinian issue. Well, the day for complaining about it is done. It is time for us to get a strategy together to remedy those things. And so that's what I'm hoping. I hope I'm answering your question.
No, absolutely. And could you speak to absolutely? And I think, we have to go as institutions, nonprofits, we have to go more than just recognizing, having a consciousness about it, right? We have to develop meaningful policy to really have a healthier, we can have just civil rights for African Americans, right? And so what kind of, I guess at the federal level or a political policy level, what is something you would like to see?
Well, definitely police misconduct, brutality, and murder. That has to stop. It's been going on way before I was born. And I've recognized it. It's been going on during my teenage years. Cops used to have throw down weapons that they put in your hand if they shot you unjustly. And so these things have been going on for years, and people are still struggling with it. I'd like to see that end, but there are so many things in the African American community. First of all, I think we need to recognize the successes that we've had, because I think a lot of people still focus on slavery, they still focus on oppression, but even during those times, we created, this large amount of genius that came out of that era. If you look at Dr. Charles Drew, Daniel Hale Williams, Gwendolyn Brooks, Benjamin Banneker, and the list goes on and on and on, who created, who were inventors, who were scientists, who were scholars, etc., came out of the worst situation that you can think of. And to me, we don't recognize that enough, because people who come here way after these things have taken place think that we've just been here sitting on our thumbs. And I hear Muslims tell me that, well, you guys just need to work harder. Well, hell, what do you think they brought us over here for? We came over here working hard, and we worked hard all through the worst of oppression in U.S. history. So it's important for us to recognize the successes that we've had, and then use that as a model. Not that it's the same time, but use it as a model for Muslims, that Muslims are very successful now. I think a good majority of our brothers from other places come here, they're educated, they're well off, but mentally, spiritually, etc., you know, their faith has got to be strengthened. They got to see themselves different. They got to see themselves as being serious contributors, which they are, and they got to be more demanding and not be so reverent to the system, as it were. And I think that, but with the union of all us coming together, that we can help with that. I'm answering your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a great job. Absolutely.
Not going to a different direction.
No, absolutely. You're doing really great. You know, it reminds me, you know, and you make really great points that we as a community, including Muslims, we have to learn and we have to unlearn a lot of what we have learned in the past. Yes. And those are really great points. Brother Mustafa, I'm going to give you any last word about Juneteenth, and I'm going to hand it over to Ambreen to talk more about the diversity campaign. So final word for you.
Well, I want us to take this time of Juneteenth as a way of unifying. I always think that we need to spend time unifying intra-faith in the community, that we need to stop with the sectarianism, the racism. We have these things in the Muslim community. And, you know, I wish I had $1 for every Muslim say, oh, Islam has no racism, no this, that, and the other. Well, we're not talking about Islam. We're talking about Muslims. And we need to unify around those things that we agree on. Don't waste time with things you don't agree on, but find the unity within that. Juneteenth is just one of those things. The historical value of it and what it did and how it happened can also serve as a benchmark for what we need to do as Muslims, and how we need to be integrated in a real way in this society, and not to be too reverent for other types of thinking. So inshallah, I hope that makes some sense.
Absolutely.
But thanks again for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation on Thursday.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Brother Mustafa. Powerful words. I'm going to hand it over to Ambreen before I close the program to talk a little bit about the diversity campaign that we're doing here at CAIR.
Okay.
And Sister Ambreen, if you could just unmute.
Yeah, perfect. Mashallah. Thank you all so much. Mustafa, as always, leaves me so inspired like I said, as we continue to do this work, especially on a local level. I love that he brought up Emancipation Park. It's actually a pretty wonderful site here in Houston, worth checking out if you are in Houston or in the area. We host a lot of our protests and rallies there. So it is a very important site in that way. And I'm really, really happy to see that a lot of our activists continue to use that space and honor it in such a way. So going back to the diversity campaign that CAIR National is launching, this is in partnership with all of the chapters across the nation to bring you programming just like this. It's an opportunity for all of us to honor again the historical events and movements, right, that are happening, at this time, and it helps us also reflect then and now. So alhamdulillah, this was a very small sample as to what that looks like. Small but very big, today we covered the history piece, historical piece, and on Thursday is going to be the part 2, focusing on the now and the future. So to prelim you guys on what Thursday is, we are going to be, the name of the topic, is called Remembering the Past and Empowering Our Future, Exploring Juneteenth Reflections and today's Fight on Racial Injustice. So again, thank you all for the wonderful questions. Please make sure that you tune back in for Thursday's CAIR on Air as we continue again this dialogue. Before I sign off, I would love to just share final advice, and that is to all of our viewers, please make sure that you continue to support your local organizations that are doing this work. It's so important right now, especially during the pandemic, that we support the organizations that are doing a lot of the advocacy for all of our communities, especially the most vulnerable. And there are many ways that you can support by donating or volunteering. And then with this week, Juneteenth being this Saturday, I implore you all again to do some reading, watch documentaries on this historical event, and encourage dialogue as much as possible within your friends and family circles. And that's it for now that I have until Thursday. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that, Umbreen. And thank you all for joining us for today's episode of CAIR on Air. If you have any topics you would like us to cover, just email us at info@cair.com. And again, as Umbreen said, you could tune in for part 2 of the series this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Remember to like and share this on Facebook and YouTube. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all this Thursday. Assalamu alaikum, and see you all soon.